Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel Ellis. I'm a psychologist, a psychotherapist, and a Buddhist scholar. And in my podcast, I reflect on deep psychological questions, sometimes about spirituality. I'm quite critical about developments in pop psychology, so I comment on that as well. And generally, I like to delve in depth into psychological topics. And today, I would like to reflect on a tool that I use in my therapeutic practice, which proved to be quite handy when it comes to support people and giving them an orientation in their life. So often enough in my clinical practice, clients are at a crossroads at their life. They have to make important decisions for themselves, for their family, about work, and at the same time, they look inside and they don't find a clear resonance to what they want. And then, of course, those decisions become quite cumbersome and difficult because when we would like to make decisions of this magnitude, then, of course, we would like to refer to a resonance, to a gut feeling, to an intuition that supports us in the long run. And for that purpose, I developed a relatively simple structure of three basic approaches to life, of which the first I would like to discuss today. The first orientation is the virtue orientation to life. In the upcoming episodes, I will talk about the needs-oriented perspective or approach to life, and the third, finally, is the self-avoidant type. I will mention the three of them a little bit today while focusing on the virtue-oriented type, but in much more detail, I will come to talk about them in the upcoming weeks. When we speak about approaches, types of people, and so on, we always have to keep in mind that we never find purity in life. Life is always a mixture of things. So when I focus on the virtue-oriented type today, please understand it in a way that this is an orientation of somewhat of a person who has in their mix more aspects of this virtue orientation. It doesn't mean that they're 100% virtue oriented. We find this extremely rarely or never at all. And once again, the purpose and the clinical practice, and maybe also for you as the listener, is to develop some sort of a compass, a reference structure that helps you to understand where you are in your life. And if you are satisfied with the priorities that you have set up, and if you want to change something, in which direction. Okay, so talking about virtue, the concept of virtue is, of course, old. We find it in many systems of philosophy, for example, in the old Greeks. And in ancient times, we can say that those virtues have been, for a long time, orientation points. I will give you some example of virtues. Some of them are historical, some are more recent, but just so that we get a little bit more of an understanding of what I'm actually talking about. So some examples are truthfulness, honesty, courage, justice, moderation, self-knowledge, tolerance, openness, friendship, knowledge, education, freedom, fairness, self-determination, ethics, a sense of responsibility, benevolence, solidarity, peace, compassion, environmental protection, which is important today, cooperation. So this does not encompass all virtues possible, of course, but I think it fairly covers the most important ones. Now, even if we had virtue orientation in ancient philosophy in medieval times, according to Christian virtues, for example, today I would like to understand it in a different way. For me, in order for such a quality to be a real virtue, it needs to have a specific relationship to the unconscious. For the unconscious, a virtue is something that it submits to because the virtue offers a higher power of integration. Now, this is quite abstract, but let me elaborate a little bit more. When I take a virtue, let's say honesty, it can be two things, more or less. It can be something that I have developed for myself based on my life experiences, based on what I like to see more in the world. I have digested it, I have practiced it, I have lived with my shortcomings, incorporated them as well, and come to a holistic understanding of the concept of honesty, for example, for my purposes, for my life. Now, this is one way to approach it. More common is that honesty is introjected, and I will come to explain this term just in a bit, introjected from parents and from society. Yes, they call it a virtue or a value, but what is happening in our minds with our conscious is that it gets established as the part of what we call superego with psychoanalytic terms, which means it is an instance, a voice within us that operates on the basis of should, shouldn't, and must. And this, for me, for the purpose of therapy, is not a virtue. If, for example, through the education of parents, let's say honesty was for my parents an important thing that they wanted to bestow on me. Now, in which circumstances does this get into my system? It is something that my parents want me to learn. So I'm talking now about a kid, a small kid. And so they react in a certain way if I'm honest or not honest. When I'm honest, they reward me, they give me positive feedback. They show me in so many ways that this is what they would hope to see. And thus I clearly understand that they like me more, that they love me more if I display this behavior. And if I'm dishonest, the opposite. So how much is the content of this value, of this virtue, actually in the center of the educating context? What is important, what is much more important than honesty, is to be liked and respected by my parents. So the context in which usually what we call virtues are children are exposed to or brought up with is in an ambivalent context where it's not really about this content, for example, of honesty or compassion or diligence or whatever you want to take, but it's about acceptance and love. And this is what we get a trade-off. Let me develop honesty in order to be accepted. Okay, so this is the original situation. And then after a while, what happens with children is that they internalize this value, this virtue, and then we don't need the parents anymore to tell us or to reward us or to sanction or punish us. We do it ourselves. And the term for this is introjection. It comes from Latin and literally means to be thrown inside. And why I emphasize the thrown inside is that it's not really digested and it's not really integrated. So what is happening in an introjection is for something, an alien body, which is, for example, the value or the virtue of parents, to be thrown inside my system. It is relatively isolated. If I don't follow it, my own system punishes me. But again, as I said, for my purposes, this is not a real virtue. A real virtue is something that I have developed for myself. I got to understand it, and I have implemented it not in the way that society wants, or my parents or my peers want, but exactly as I want. Why is that important? Because if I do it with such subtlety and diligence towards my own system, it develops a whole new relationship with the unconscious, where the unconscious reacts in an ambivalent way to an introject, so to educated values. If I integrate it and consciously work with it, the unconscious is quite willing to submit its own needs under those virtues, under those values. The result of that is that a truly value or virtue oriented person is quite at peace with themselves because they are left in peace by their unconscious. Their unconscious is not bothering them. They're standing behind them because of how well integrated and thought through the implementation of those virtues are. So virtues, as you could understand from my examples, they are maxims of life of an almost religious quality. Again, they're consciously chosen, and because they're so consciously chosen, developed, nourished, fine-tuned, etc., they're also very simple to make conscious again. What I mean with that is, if a person comes up to me and asks me what is important in my life, what are my guiding principles, if I'm a virtue-oriented person, I can quite easily just evoke my virtues inside of me and talk to them about how it is important, why it is important, the history of my implementation, and so forth, versus if it's an introject, superego, the stuff that consists of musts and shoulds and shouldn't and mustn'ts, then it may be quite difficult for me to answer those questions. What are my guiding principles? Because good part of those introjects are just unconscious and I'm not noticing them anymore. They are on autopilot and are difficult to bring up into consciousness again. And what is essential about virtues, I tried to put it in different ways so that you get an understanding of it. The whole being resonates with the virtues. It's not a splinter, it's not a fragment, it's not one voice among many that is connected in an ambivalent way with those other voices. Basically, my whole being stands behind the virtue. And so virtues are something that quite in a straight manner represent the good for me because I stand behind them, because my unconscious stays behind them, my needs stand behind them. And just a different way of putting it is, it's good for me. And it's good for me not just for myself, because a virtue is not characterized by a selfish or self-oriented nature. Even when I perceive that someone is acting on this virtue independently from me and I don't get any benefit from it, if I have honesty as a virtue and I witness how someone else is honest, I am joyful with them or for them, even if I don't benefit directly from that. So regardless if I act on it or someone else or society, my heart opens up, my being resonates, I find it good. It's good for me, it's good for others. And just because the content on a word level is so similar to introjects, it is so essential to distinguish the two. And I would like to give you an example. If we take a radical environmentalist, for example, just from their attitude, it's not possible to distinguish if they are virtue-oriented or neurotic, as I call it, ambivalent, childish, and so on. We have to see what happens in the process of the implementation, of the application. So a virtue-oriented environmentalist remains satisfied regardless of the effects or the successes of their actions, because they're following something that they find good in itself. They don't depend on a fulfillment or achieving a goal. They are fine with doing what is important and good for them. The neurotic environmentalist, on the other hand, is guided by aggression, often enough self-righteous arrogance, and when they fail to achieve their goals, they become frustrated because they are result-oriented, disillusioned, and ultimately depressed. Now, does a virtue-oriented person necessarily have to be a good person? No. Often enough, this will be the case because, like I said, it is integrated and there's some goodwill that it needs to connect to, but in some rare examples, it's possible that they act in a quite harsh or disrespectful or antisocial ways and still remain value oriented just because they have morphed their whole character and their unconscious in that direction. So someone who is a radical environmentalist could be value and virtue oriented and still, for example, commit crimes against other people just because they have warped, they have changed their personality in that direction, and they could still remain unaffected by the results of their actions. And it could still be the most important thing for them to actually do those actions that they find important without looking or depending so much on the outcome. Okay, now every type that I describe of the three, and again, the three are virtue orientation, needs orientation, and the self-avoidant type. Every type has its own problems, challenges, or dangers, as I call it. The virtue-oriented, I've identified three types of dangers or challenges. One is that it might be possible easily to suppress their needs when they orient their actions and communication towards virtues. Why is that? Because they're not fully skilled in the implementation of virtues. They have good intentions in mind, but when it comes to the implementation, the virtues are not yet fully digested, which means that the unconscious has not fully submitted itself to the virtues, which again in turn means that the needs of the unconscious, the drives, the desires of the unconscious are still fully active in a somewhat isolated way. And then if the person is value oriented, let's say they're quite idealistic, they want to do the right thing, they have partly chewed, they have partly processed the virtues into their system, but there is still, let's say, for example, their needs and drives of power inside of them. The person, because they don't want them, they want to be value oriented, virtue oriented, they neglect those needs and drives. They don't want them because they want to be good people according to their virtues. What follows is that the unconscious is not convinced fully. It has those needs for power, let's say, wants to act them out. The conscious subject doesn't want to see it, doesn't want to hear it, suppresses those needs, and the unconscious is punishing the subject with uncomfortable feelings. And it reduces the communication to the conscious part, which leads to dissatisfaction and eventually down the road to depressive episodes. So this is the most important challenge or danger, I would say, for the virtue-oriented type, which is to suppress their needs. The second danger for me is that a person was virtue-oriented and has done their work in that respect. As time goes by, they rely too much on the virtues remaining the same. And this we cannot do. Every couple of months, every couple of years, we have to update the importance of what we are following so that it remains alive. And in this example, if someone has not updated their virtues, they become again neurotic introjects done by themselves, copies of what in the past was wholesome, resonant, and so on. And then again, the unconscious is retrieving, is sabotaging, is claiming its own rights, is basically not submitting itself and not submitting its needs. And the third danger is falsely viewing neurotic introjects of the superego as virtues. This is what I already mentioned, that I like humbleness. I want to give that more space in my life, but actually I have not done the work. I just take the title. I'm fascinated by the idea. I want to slap that label onto my actions and my thoughts, to be a good Buddhist, to be a good person, to be not competitive, whatever it is. But then in the end, it's just a label. My unconscious is not convinced. And so again, it reacts. To make sure to drive this differentiation home between virtue orientation and neurotic, as I call it, introjects, someone who is following introjects will never achieve the goal, and they are frustrated by that. They end up wanting to control circumstances or themselves in order to get there. Many people are like that. The virtue-oriented person is satisfied with following the right, the good thing to do, and they simply don't need to control others or themselves for that purpose. The self-worth remains intact, in other words, regardless of the fulfillment of the virtue or the implementation of the virtue. Now, let's look at a successful implementation after reflecting a bit on the challenges. When a virtue is successfully implemented and applied in life, still the conscious subject, me, the person, is not addressing their unconscious. And this is quite a remarkable thing. By having worked through, chewed, developed the virtue and implemented it fully into their life, they have achieved an integration of their personality so that the goal of the subject, the goal of the person, is basically achieved, the goal of the person in life, to find unity, satisfaction, calmness. And so the unconscious simply is hardly participating or not as a disturbing factor. Of course, we need the unconscious to properly function, but it doesn't appear as a separate agent within us, giving us voices, impulses, drives, dreams, dissatisfaction, trying to guide us into other directions. It simply does not do that because of the integrative power of the virtue orientation in general. So it's not about gaining perfection when we are virtue oriented, but simply to do the right thing by having the proper, clear orientation in any major situation in my life. Now, all three types have characteristic relationships with circumstances. They have characteristic relationships to themselves. And there are implications about the social life, the interpersonal realm. Now, what is the relationship of the virtue-oriented to circumstances, to their life circumstances? Interesting here and of therapeutic relevance. When implemented, the virtue-oriented subject does not depend on the environment. So what follows from that is a virtue orientation gives me a lot of autonomy, self-reliance, independence. It looks like self-control, but actually it is not. Nothing needs to be controlled there, because self-control would be in the realm of an ambivalent relationship to the unconscious. I don't need to manage uncomfortable feelings or thoughts that come up that would make me defensive, that would make me anxious, depleted, reflect my position to authority, question how I should deal with my partner, and so on. All of that is irrelevant. I'm doing the right thing for me. I'm following the virtues that I have put into my own system. So, the main advantage from a therapeutic perspective of someone to develop the virtues in their life, the virtue orientation, is to become less dependent, more independent from their immediate environment. Because so much of dissatisfaction and pain comes from that interaction with the outside world and from people. So virtue orientation would be a cleaning, a simplification, gathering strength through that independence and by doing what is good for me. And as I see the process, at least, after a while, I can open up more to the interaction between me and the surroundings. So this film, this layer of independence that I have acquired through virtue orientation can remain intact, ideally become semi-permeable so that I can relate more to other people, I can relate more to work, and thus just gain different qualities in life, which I will talk about when I reflect on the needs-oriented person. To give you a small hint, the virtue-oriented person is calm, peaceful. The needs-oriented, the successful needs-oriented person is happy and joyful. So depending on what I want in life, ideally, I think most people would prefer a mix of the two, of calmness and joy. And in order to get there, I propose that it might be beneficial to start with more of a virtue orientation and then to bring in more needs into my life to fulfill them and thus become more happy and joyful in general. Now, what is my relation to myself if I am virtue oriented? Again, I'm not too much interested in what is going on inside of me. I'm not addressing my unconscious. The unconscious submits to me. What I need to do is, as I described in the challenges or dangers, I have to maintain my virtue orientation updated. Every once in a while, it doesn't have to be, certainly not on a day-to-day basis or not even on a month-to-month basis, but every couple of months, every few years, I have to do a big checkup and to see if my virtue orientation is still the same, if I have to reframe it for myself, or if I have to reprioritize my virtues. And in the interpersonal area, in the social realm, what is the effect of a virtue orientation there? And this is quite unique. We see the fingerprint there because a virtue-oriented person might seem quite aloof, independent, cold, untouchable. Not for the wrong reasons, right? There might be people who are neurotic, or there are many types of people who are unhealthy and who, because of their unhealthy approach or difficult life experiences, or for whatever reason, they seem to be cut off from the contact to other people. The virtue-oriented person is also cut off in a very specific way because they're simply not interested in satisfying social needs that they would have with other people. Why? Because social needs belong to the unconscious. The social realm can be represented by virtues, for example, kindness, benevolence, but here it's not about building a relationship with someone. in such an orientation, when I have kindness as a virtue, the people around me basically give me the possibility to act on my virtue, but it's not that I satisfy my needs with them. Again, to make it clear, if I'm fulfilling the kindness, is not my interest. I'm not needs oriented. So there might be someone in the needs of help around me. I want to be kind because I have kindness is one of the important virtues. I offer them my support and they reject it. I'm totally fine. It doesn't faze me. I'm not defined by the satisfaction of a certain goal. I'm offering, I'm living my principles, I'm living my virtues, and whether it manifests in some sort of a conclusion is not of my interest. I already done the good deed for myself. Okay, so this was the basic reflection on virtue orientation. I hope you join me in the upcoming weeks for the discussion of the needs-oriented person and the self-avoidant orientation. And please leave comments below if you have questions, and I will try to get into them in the following episodes. Thank you and see you then.